The satin wedding dress Sophie wore as she strutted into my bridal suite was identical to mine. Same designer, same beadwork, same cathedral train that I had spent months selecting for what was supposed to be the most important day of my life. But while my dress hung lifeless on its hanger, waiting for a ceremony that would never happen, Sophie's hugged her perfect figure like armor as she delivered the killing blow that would shatter everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and family. "Emma, darling," she purred, her voice carrying the same condescending sweetness she had perfected during our childhood, when she wanted to be cruel while maintaining plausible innocence. "I'm afraid there's been a change of plans. David and I are getting married today instead." The words hit me like ice water, each syllable crystallizing into a reality that my mind refused to accept, even as my heart began the slow, agonizing process of breaking into pieces that I wasn't sure could ever be reassembled. My sister, my beautiful, talented, golden child sister who had never wanted for anything, was standing in my bridal suite, wearing a wedding dress, claiming the man I had been planning to marry in less than 6 hours. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, though the sick feeling in my stomach suggested that I already knew exactly what she was talking about, had probably known on some unconscious level for weeks, as David became increasingly distant, and Sophie made increasingly frequent visits to our apartment, under the guise of helping with wedding preparations. "Oh, Emma," Sophie sighed with the kind of exaggerated patience usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to small children. "Surely you must have realized that David was never really yours. He was always meant to be with me, but you were so desperate, so clingy, that we couldn't figure out how to let you down gently." She moved through my bridal suite with the confident grace of someone who had never doubted her right to take whatever she wanted from life, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the afternoon light as she examined the flowers, the jewelry, the carefully arranged details that were supposed to celebrate my happiness, but had instead become props in her performance of sisterly superiority. "We tried to wait until after the wedding," she continued, adjusting her veil in the mirror with the casual satisfaction of someone whose reflection had never disappointed her. "But David finally admitted that he couldn't go through with marrying his second choice when his heart belonged to someone else. It wouldn't be fair to any of us to pretend that you were ever more than a placeholder until I was ready to settle down. Second choice, placeholder." The words carved themselves into my consciousness with surgical precision, opening wounds that I didn't even know existed until Sophie's casual cruelty exposed them to the harsh light of truth. For 3 years, I had believed that David loved me, had cherished every moment of what I thought was a genuine romance built on mutual respect and shared dreams for our future together. "David loves me," I said, though my voice lacked the conviction that statement should have carried, sounding more like a question than a declaration of certainty. Sophie's laughter was bright and musical, the same sound that had charmed teachers, boyfriends, and family friends throughout our childhood, while I remained invisible in her shadow. "Oh, sweetheart, David has been in love with me since the day you introduced us. Surely you noticed how his face changed whenever I entered the room, how he always found excuses to spend time with me when I visited, how he started asking about my schedule, my interests, my relationship status." The memories she referenced came flooding back with devastating clarity. David's sudden interest in art galleries after learning that Sophie worked as a curator, his questions about her travel plans, his insistence that she join us for dinners and weekend trips that were supposed to be romantic couple time. I had interpreted his attention to my sister as kindness toward my family, evidence of how well he would fit into my life once we were married. "You're lying," I said, though the protest sounded hollow even to my own ears, as I began connecting dots that had been hiding in plain sight for months. "Am I?" Sophie asked, pulling out her phone with theatrical timing that suggested she had been planning this moment for weeks. "Would you like to see the text messages he's been sending me? The love letters? The photos from the weekend trips we've taken together while you were working those ridiculous double shifts to pay for this elaborate wedding?" The double shifts she referenced so dismissively had been my attempt to contribute to our future, working overtime at the marketing firm, where I was slowly building a career, while David pursued his graduate degree in architecture. The extra money had gone toward wedding expenses, household improvements, and what I had believed were shared financial goals for building a life together. "David doesn't have money for weekend trips," I said, clinging to practical realities that might expose the flaws in Sophie's story. "He's a student living on scholarships and part-time work." Sophie's smile carried the kind of secret knowledge that made my stomach clench with dread. "Oh, Emma, you really don't know anything, do you? David hasn't been living on scholarships and part-time work for years. He's been living on you." She moved closer, her voice dropping to the intimate tone of someone sharing devastating gossip. "That luxury apartment he supposedly shares with roommates? You've been paying the entire rent through that anonymous donor program you set up because you thought he was too proud to accept direct help. The car payments, the credit card bills, the graduate school expenses, all funded by your overtime wages while you lived in that tiny studio apartment to save money for our future. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, forcing me to sit down on the bed where my abandoned wedding dress lay in accusatory silence. For 2 years, I had been secretly supporting David's comfortable lifestyle through a complex arrangement of anonymous payments and financial assistance that I had convinced myself was helping a struggling student rather than enabling a manipulative fraud. "He doesn't know," I whispered, more to myself than to Sophie, as if maintaining David's ignorance of my financial support might preserve some dignity in this catastrophic situation. "Of course he knows," Sophie replied with casual cruelty. "Who do you think suggested the anonymous donor program in the first place? David has been laughing about your pathetic generosity for months, telling me how easy it was to manipulate you into paying his bills while he pursued the woman he actually wanted. Standing there in my sister's shadow, wearing the engagement ring that had apparently always been intended for someone else, I realized that my entire relationship had been an elaborate performance, designed to extract financial support, while David worked up the courage to claim the prize he had always preferred. Sophie had been born golden, literally and figuratively, with hair that caught sunlight like spun precious metal, and a smile that could make adults forget whatever rules they were supposed to enforce. From her first breath, she had possessed the kind of effortless charisma that transformed ordinary moments into celebrations of her existence, while I had been relegated to the role of supportive audience member in the ongoing production of Sophie's charmed life. "Your sister is so special," became the refrain that defined my childhood, spoken by teachers who forgave Sophie's incomplete homework while noting my perfect attendance and academic achievements as evidence that I was trying hard to compensate for my lack of natural gifts. "You're lucky to have such an inspiring example to follow." The inspiring example had set impossible standards from an early age. Sophie's kindergarten teacher had called her artistically gifted, after she drew a butterfly that looked more like colorful scribbles than any identifiable creature, while my technically accurate drawings of houses and trees were dismissed as very neat, very careful, with the kind of faint praise that suggested carefulness was a consolation prize for those who lacked true creativity. By middle school, the pattern was permanently established. Sophie as the dazzling star who illuminated every room she entered, and Emma as the reliable supporting cast member who kept track of details, managed logistics, and provided the steady foundation that allowed Sophie's brightness to shine more brilliantly by contrast. "Sophie has such natural leadership abilities," our mother would brag to her book club friends while they sipped wine in our living room, cataloging my sister's election as class president, her selection for the lead role in the school play, and her invitation to join the advanced art program. "Emma is wonderful too, of course. So dependable, so hardworking. But Sophie just has that special something that makes people drawn to her." The special something had continued attracting people throughout high school and college, creating a constant parade of admirers, friends, and opportunities that seemed to seek Sophie out rather than requiring any effort on her part to pursue them. Scholarships for her art studies, internships at prestigious galleries, job offers from employers who had heard about her talent through professional networks. Everything had fallen into place with the kind of cosmic timing that reinforced everyone's belief that Sophie was destined for extraordinary things. Meanwhile, I had earned my marketing degree through student loans, merit scholarships, and part-time jobs that left me exhausted but grateful for opportunities that had to be earned rather than given. My career progression had been methodical and unremarkable. Entry-level positions, incremental raises, careful professional relationships that built slowly over time, rather than blooming into instant recognition of my supposedly obvious potential. "Emma's doing very well for herself," our mother would say, when friends asked about both daughters, her tone suggesting that very well was the ceiling for someone with my particular combination of attributes. "She's so practical, so reliable. She'll never be flashy like Sophie, but she's building a solid, stable life that suits her perfectly." The solid, stable life had included a series of relationships with men who appreciated my reliability, but were never quite passionate about my company, who found me comfortable rather than exciting, who stayed with me until they met someone who inspired the kind of intense feelings that apparently I was incapable of generating in romantic partners. "You're too nice," Sophie had explained after my previous relationship ended when Marcus decided he needed more excitement in his romantic life. "Men want to chase something they can't easily catch. You make yourself too available, too accommodating." They get bored because there's no challenge in winning you over. The advice had stung, because it suggested that my kindness and consideration were character flaws rather than virtues, that treating people well was somehow a strategic error in romantic relationships rather than basic human decency. But I had taken Sophie's criticism to heart, trying to be more mysterious, more challenging, more exciting when I met David 18 months later at a coffee shop near the university where he was completing his graduate program in architecture. David had seemed different from my previous boyfriends, more intellectually curious, more ambitious, more genuinely interested in building a future with someone who shared his values, rather than just seeking entertainment until someone better came along. Our relationship had developed naturally over months of conversation about books, travel plans, career goals, and the kind of life we wanted to create together. "This one seems serious," our mother had observed after meeting David for the first time, her tone carrying surprise that I had managed to attract someone with obvious intelligence and professional prospects. "He seems to genuinely care about you, Emma. You should be careful not to do anything that might scare him away." The warning had reinforced my determination to be the perfect girlfriend. Supportive but not clingy, interested but not possessive, generous but not overwhelming. I had worked overtime to contribute to our shared expenses, planned romantic surprises to show my appreciation for his attention, and gone out of my way to integrate him into my family relationships because I wanted him to feel welcomed and loved. "David is wonderful," Sophie had said after their first meeting, her eyes lighting up with the kind of genuine enthusiasm she usually reserved for art exhibitions or travel opportunities. "You're so lucky to have found someone who appreciates all your best qualities." I had been grateful for Sophie's approval, interpreting her interest in David as sisterly support for my happiness, rather than competitive assessment of a man who might be worth pursuing. When she began asking questions about his background, his career plans, and his relationship history, I had answered eagerly, happy to share details about the man I was falling in love with. When she started joining us for dinners and weekend activities, I had been pleased that my sister was making an effort to build a relationship with my boyfriend, rather than dismissing him as another of Emma's unremarkable romantic choices. I had never suspected that Sophie's interest in David was anything other than supportive, until she walked into my bridal suite wearing a wedding dress and claiming the man I had planned to marry. David Chen had walked into my life with the kind of understated confidence that comes from knowing you're intellectually gifted, but choosing to wear that intelligence lightly, like a perfectly tailored suit that enhances rather than announces your natural advantages. When we met at Cornerstone Coffee, he was sketching architectural details in a worn leather notebook, while reviewing what appeared to be graduate-level engineering textbooks, the picture of a serious student dedicated to mastering his craft. "Sorry," he had said, when I accidentally bumped his table while juggling my laptop bag and coffee cup, his smile warm and genuine as he helped me gather scattered papers from my own marketing projects. "I tend to spread out when I'm working. The hazards of thinking in 3 dimensions while sitting in 2-dimensional space." The comment had been perfectly calibrated to display intellectual sophistication without seeming pretentious, and his offer to buy me a replacement coffee after I had spilled mine in the collision had led to 3 hours of conversation that felt like discovering a kindred spirit who shared my values about work, ambition, and building meaningful relationships. "Architecture is about creating spaces where people can live their best lives," he had explained, while showing me sketches of sustainable housing projects and community development plans that demonstrated both technical skill and social consciousness. "It's not just about designing beautiful buildings. It's about understanding how physical environments shape human potential." The philosophy had aligned perfectly with my own beliefs about marketing as a tool for connecting people with products and services that could genuinely improve their lives, rather than just manipulating them into buying things they didn't need. David seemed to approach his profession with the same ethical framework that I tried to bring to my work. Success measured by positive impact rather than just financial return. Over the following months, our relationship had developed with the kind of steady progression that suggested genuine compatibility rather than superficial attraction. David was thoughtful about planning dates that matched my interests and budget limitations, considerate about my work schedule when making social plans, and supportive of my career goals in ways that felt authentic rather than performative. "You have such a clear vision for building your career strategically," he had said, after reviewing a presentation I was developing for a major client pitch, his feedback both encouraging and professionally insightful. "Most people think marketing is just about creativity, but you understand the analytical side that makes campaigns actually effective." The intellectual respect had been intoxicating after years of relationships with men who treated my professional ambitions as cute hobbies rather than serious career development. David engaged with my work as an equal, offering suggestions that demonstrated understanding of marketing strategy, while seeking my opinions about architectural projects that challenged conventional approaches to urban planning. But beneath the surface compatibility, I had gradually become aware of financial inconsistencies that didn't align with his stated circumstances as a graduate student living on modest scholarships and part-time income. The luxury apartment in the city's most expensive neighborhood, the designer clothes that he wore casually as if they were everyday purchases, the expensive dinners and weekend trips that he suggested despite claiming to live on a tight budget. "I'm lucky to have generous grandparents," he had explained when I questioned how he could afford amenities that seemed beyond typical student means. "They believe education is the best investment, and they're willing to support my studies through graduate school. It's temporary assistance that I'll pay back once I establish my career." The explanation had been reasonable and delivered with appropriate gratitude for family support that many students could only dream of receiving. When I offered to contribute more to our shared expenses to ease his financial burden, David had graciously declined while appreciating my generosity of spirit. "Emma, you're already working so hard to build your own financial security," he had said with the kind of protective concern that made me feel cherished rather than burdensome. I wouldn't feel right accepting money from someone who's sacrificing so much to establish her career. "My family situation gives me advantages that you shouldn't have to subsidize." The conversations about money had reinforced my impression that David was both financially responsible and ethically principled, grateful for family support, but conscious of not taking advantage of his girlfriend's limited resources. When I suggested that we move in together to share housing costs, he had expressed concern about the financial impact on my carefully planned budget. "I love spending time with you, but I don't want our relationship to create financial stress in your life," he had said, during one of many discussions about taking our relationship to the next level. "You've worked so hard to establish independence and stability. I'd rather wait until we're both in stronger financial positions than risk putting pressure on resources you need for your own security." The thoughtfulness had seemed romantic rather than suspicious, evidence of a man who prioritized my well-being over his own convenience or desires. When he eventually agreed to move in together after I found a larger apartment that we could theoretically afford on our combined student and entry-level professional incomes, David had insisted on paying his fair share despite his supposed graduate student financial limitations. "I want us to be true partners in this relationship," he had said while reviewing apartment listings and budget projections that would make cohabitation financially viable. "That means contributing equally to our shared life, even if it requires me to work additional part-time hours or be more creative about managing my expenses." The partnership had felt genuine and equitable, built on mutual respect and shared financial responsibility that demonstrated our compatibility as potential life partners. David's willingness to work harder to afford our life together had seemed like evidence of his commitment to our relationship, rather than performance designed to maintain an elaborate deception. Looking back through the lens of Sophie's revelations, I could see how carefully David had constructed his facade of struggling graduate student who was making sacrifices to build a life with me, when the reality was that I had been unknowingly funding his comfortable lifestyle while he pursued my sister behind my back. The discovery of David's financial deception had begun innocuously enough, with a misdirected piece of mail that arrived at our shared apartment 6 months into our cohabitation, a credit card statement addressed to David Chen, but delivered to our address with a balance that made my stomach clench with sympathetic anxiety for his apparent financial struggles. The statement showed charges totaling $4,840 for a single month, including payments to restaurants I had never heard of, clothing stores that sold designer items far beyond any student budget, and travel expenses that seemed incompatible with his claims about living frugally while pursuing his graduate degree. The minimum payment due was more than I spent on groceries in 2 months. "David," I had said carefully that evening, holding the statement with hands that trembled slightly from the stress of discussing financial problems that might affect our shared future, "I think your credit card statement was delivered here by mistake. The balance looks really concerning. Are you okay financially?" His reaction had been immediate and convincing. Genuine distress at having his private financial struggles exposed, embarrassment about debt that he characterized as temporary difficulties rather than ongoing lifestyle inflation, and gratitude for my concern while firmly declining any offers of direct assistance. "Emma, I'm so sorry you had to see that," he had said, his voice carrying the shame of someone whose pride had been damaged by unwanted exposure of personal problems. "I've been dealing with some unexpected expenses related to my thesis research, materials, software licenses, equipment that my scholarship doesn't cover. I didn't want to worry you with financial problems that I'm working to solve." The explanation had been delivered with appropriate vulnerability, creating intimacy through shared knowledge of his struggles, rather than distance through hidden deception. When I offered to help with expenses or adjust our shared budget to ease his financial pressure, David had been appropriately grateful while maintaining boundaries that preserved his dignity. "You're already contributing so much to our life together," he had said, his appreciation seeming genuine rather than manipulative. "I wouldn't feel right accepting money from you when these are problems I created through my own poor planning. Let me figure out solutions that don't involve asking my girlfriend to subsidize my mistakes." But over the following weeks, I had noticed signs of increasing financial stress that didn't align with his claims about working toward solutions. Phone calls with credit card companies that he took privately, mail delivery that he intercepted before I could see it, and a general anxiety about money that seemed to be affecting his sleep and concentration. The anonymous donor program had been my attempt to provide assistance while preserving David's pride and our relationship dynamics. Through careful research, I had identified the scholarship office at his university and arranged to make monthly contributions that would be distributed as emergency financial assistance for graduate students facing unexpected hardships. "It's completely anonymous," the financial aid counselor had assured me during the setup process, explaining how the donations would be processed to protect both donors and recipients from any awkwardness or obligation. "Students receive assistance based on demonstrated need without knowing who provided the funding. It maintains dignity while providing crucial support during temporary financial difficulties." The program had allowed me to contribute $800 per month, nearly a third of my take-home pay, to David's support without creating relationship complications or wounded pride that might damage our partnership. I had convinced myself that this was a temporary investment in our shared future, helping the man I loved through a difficult period so we could build stability together once he completed his degree. "My financial situation has improved dramatically," David had reported after the first payment had been processed, his relief and gratitude seeming authentic, as he described receiving unexpected scholarship assistance that would ease his credit card debt and allow him to focus on his studies without constant money anxiety. The success of the anonymous assistance had reinforced my belief that I was making a positive difference in David's life while maintaining healthy relationship boundaries. When he mentioned additional financial challenges over the following months, car repairs, medical expenses, computer equipment needed for his thesis work, I had quietly increased my contributions to the anonymous donor program. By the end of our first year living together, I was contributing $200 per month to David's support through the university's financial aid office, money that I earned through overtime work and weekend consulting projects that kept me exhausted but satisfied that I was investing in our future together. The anonymous scholarship program has been a lifesaver, David had told me during one of our discussions about his improving financial situation, his gratitude directed toward unknown benefactors rather than his girlfriend who was working double shifts to fund his comfortable lifestyle. Someone out there believes in supporting graduate students through temporary hardships, and their generosity has made it possible for me to focus on my education instead of worrying about money. The irony had been lost on me at the time. I was working overtime to anonymously fund the comfortable life of the man who was sleeping in my bed while planning a future with my sister. My generosity had been enabling his deception by providing the financial security that allowed him to pursue Sophie without concern about the practical consequences of losing his primary source of support. Now, standing in my abandoned bridal suite while Sophie gloated about claiming the man I had been unknowingly subsidizing, I realized that my secret benefactor program had been funding my own betrayal for over a year. The love I had felt for David had been as real as breathing, growing stronger with each shared conversation, each quiet evening in our apartment, each moment when he seemed to see and appreciate parts of me that previous boyfriends had overlooked or taken for granted. What I hadn't understood was that while my feelings deepened into genuine partnership and future planning, David's attention had been strategically divided between the woman who was funding his lifestyle and the woman he actually wanted to marry. "You have such a beautiful way of seeing the world," he had whispered during one of our Sunday morning conversations, when we would lie in bed talking about everything from architecture philosophy to childhood memories to dreams for the future we planned to build together. "Being with you makes me want to be more thoughtful, more intentional about how I move through life." The comments had felt profound and intimate, evidence of emotional connection that went deeper than physical attraction or temporary convenience. David seemed to genuinely value my perspective on questions that mattered to him professionally and personally, seeking my opinion about career decisions, family relationships, and the kind of life he wanted to create after graduation. "I've never felt this comfortable with anyone before," I had confessed after we'd been together for 8 months, during a conversation about moving from casual dating towards serious commitment. You make me feel like I can be completely myself without worrying about judgment or having to perform some version of femininity that doesn't feel authentic. The authenticity had felt mutual and precious, creating a foundation of trust that made discussing marriage feel natural rather than pressured. When David had started bringing up questions about wedding preferences, family traditions, and timeline for major relationship milestones, I had interpreted these conversations as evidence that he was planning a proposal rather than conducting research for a future with someone else. "What kind of wedding do you think would feel most meaningful to you?" he had asked during a walk through the botanical gardens, where we often spent Saturday afternoons, his questions seeming romantic rather than investigative. "I'm curious about whether you're more drawn to intimate celebrations or larger gatherings, traditional ceremonies or more personalized approaches." The questions had led to hours of conversations about family traditions, budget considerations, venue preferences, and guest list dynamics that I had assumed were preparation for our own wedding planning. When David had started asking similar questions about Sophie, her favorite flowers, her aesthetic preferences, her ideas about romantic celebrations, I had interpreted his interest as thoughtful consideration of my sister's role in our future family dynamics. "Sophie has such sophisticated taste," he had observed after attending one of her gallery openings, his admiration seeming brotherly rather than romantic. "I can tell that aesthetics really matter to her. When we plan our wedding, we should make sure to include details that will appeal to family members who have strong artistic sensibilities." The consideration had touched me, because it suggested that David cared about integrating well with my family, rather than just claiming me as an individual prize. His attention to Sophie's preferences had seemed like evidence of his commitment to building relationships with people who mattered to me, rather than strategic intelligence gathering for his actual romantic priorities. The engagement ring he had presented 6 months later had been everything I had dreamed of. Classic elegance without excessive drama, expensive enough to demonstrate serious commitment, but not so extravagant that it suggested poor financial planning. The proposal itself had been perfectly calibrated to my personality, private and meaningful rather than public and theatrical, focused on our shared future rather than grand romantic gestures that would have felt performative. "Emma, you've made me a better man, just by showing me what it looks like to live with integrity and kindness," he had said while kneeling in our apartment, surrounded by candles and flowers that he had arranged while I was working late to earn money for the anonymous donor program that was supporting his proposal budget. "I want to spend the rest of my life becoming worthy of the love you've given me so generously." The words had been exactly what I needed to hear. Acknowledgement of my character rather than just my convenience. Recognition of my value as a partner rather than just my utility as a financial supporter. When I said yes through tears of joy and relief that someone finally wanted to choose me permanently, I had believed that David's proposal represented the beginning of the life I had always hoped to build with someone who truly knew and appreciated me. The wedding planning that followed had felt like a collaborative celebration of our shared future, with David contributing ideas and opinions that suggested genuine investment in creating a meaningful ceremony rather than just going through expected motions. When he had suggested incorporating elements that would appeal to Sophie's artistic sensibilities, I had been grateful for his thoughtfulness, rather than suspicious of his motivations. "Sophie's opinion really matters to you," he had observed while we reviewed venue options and decoration themes, his comment delivered with apparent affection for my close sisterly relationship. "It's sweet how much you want her approval for the details. She's lucky to have a sister who values her input so highly." The observation had reinforced my pride in our family relationships and my gratitude for David's acceptance of the important people in my life. When Sophie had started spending more time helping with wedding preparations, offering suggestions and volunteering to handle details that required artistic expertise, I had interpreted her involvement as sisterly support for my happiness. I had been planning a wedding celebration that would honor the love I felt for David, while unknowingly funding his courtship of the woman who would ultimately claim him as her own prize. The timeline of David and Sophie's betrayal unfolded like a crime scene investigation, as I forced myself to examine evidence that had been hiding in plain sight for months, each memory recontextualized by the devastating knowledge that my sister and fiancé had been conducting an affair while I worked overtime to fund the lifestyle that enabled their romantic meetings. "It started at your birthday party last year," Sophie had revealed with the casual cruelty of someone who had never learned that timing matters when delivering devastating news, apparently enjoying the opportunity to provide details that would maximize my emotional devastation. "David and I ended up talking alone in the kitchen while you were opening presents, and we realized we had this incredible intellectual and emotional connection that neither of us had expected." The birthday party she referenced had been a modest celebration at our apartment, funded by the consulting work I had taken on weekends to increase my contributions to David's anonymous support fund. I remembered finding David and Sophie deep in conversation when I returned from the bathroom, their heads close together as they discussed what appeared to be philosophical questions about art, architecture, and creative vision. You two seemed to be having a meaningful conversation, I had observed with genuine pleasure, grateful that my fiancé and sister were building a friendship that would enrich our future family dynamics. Sophie was explaining how her curatorial work relates to urban planning, David had replied, his enthusiasm seeming academic rather than romantic as he described their discussion about creating spaces that enhance human creativity and social connection. She has such insightful perspectives about how aesthetic choices affect community building. The intellectual connection they had discovered that night had apparently deepened through subsequent conversations that occurred whenever Sophie visited our apartment to help with wedding planning. What I had interpreted as sisterly support and future brother-in-law bonding had actually been elaborate courtship disguised as family collaboration. We didn't plan for it to happen, Sophie continued with the kind of defensive justification that people use when they want credit for moral struggle, despite making immoral choices. But David and I have so much more in common intellectually and creatively than you two ever did. You're wonderful, Emma, but you and David were never really compatible on the deeper levels that matter for lifelong partnership. The compatibility assessment was delivered with psychological expertise that Sophie had never demonstrated before, as if she had suddenly become qualified to evaluate the emotional and intellectual foundations of relationships she had been observing from the outside. David loves your reliability and kindness, she had explained with condescending sympathy, but he needs someone who can match his intellectual curiosity and aesthetic sophistication. You're more practical than philosophical, more focused on stability than on exploring life's deeper meanings. The character analysis was devastating, because it contained enough truth to feel credible, while ignoring the genuine connection David and I had shared during hundreds of conversations about topics ranging from career ambitions to family dynamics to personal growth goals that went far beyond practical considerations. When did you start sleeping together? I had asked, forcing myself to confront the physical reality of their betrayal, despite my emotional desire to avoid details that would make their affair more concrete and irreversible. 3 months ago, Sophie had replied with matter-of-fact honesty that suggested she felt no shame about the timeline of her sexual relationship with her sister's fiancé. After we realized that our emotional connection was too strong to ignore, we decided to explore whether the physical chemistry matched our intellectual compatibility. 3 months ago. The timeframe coincided with David's increased requests for privacy when taking phone calls, his occasional absences that he attributed to thesis research and library work, and my decision to increase my anonymous financial contributions to support what I believed were additional academic expenses related to his graduation timeline. Where were you meeting? I had asked, though I dreaded the answer, because it would likely involve spaces and situations that I had unknowingly facilitated through my financial support. Usually at David's old apartment, Sophie had said with casual indifference to how this information might affect me, the one you've been paying for through that anonymous donor program you set up. We figured it was poetic justice that your generosity was creating the perfect space for us to explore our relationship without worrying about discovery. The revelation that they had been using the apartment I was secretly funding as their romantic hideaway was perhaps the most psychologically devastating detail in an already catastrophic situation. My anonymous contributions had been directly enabling their affair by providing David with a private space where he could pursue my sister without risking exposure or accountability. David knows about the donor program? I had asked, though Sophie's earlier comments had already confirmed that my supposedly anonymous generosity had been transparent to the man who was benefiting from it while betraying me. Of course he knows, Sophie had replied with the impatience of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow student. David figured it out within the first month when the timing of his financial assistance perfectly matched your overtime work schedule. He's been laughing about how easy it was to manipulate you into funding his graduate school lifestyle while he decided which sister he actually wanted to marry. The moment when I should have been walking down the aisle in the ivory silk dress I had chosen with trembling hands and endless dreams of forever, I was instead sitting on my bedroom floor in my pajamas, surrounded by wedding gifts that would need to be returned and honeymoon reservations that would need to be canceled, while the phone rang constantly with calls from confused relatives asking why the ceremony had been postponed without explanation. Emma, sweetheart, what's happening? My mother's voice crackled through the answering machine that I had been ignoring for 3 hours, her tone mixing maternal concern with social embarrassment at having to field questions from wedding guests who were arriving at an empty venue. People are starting to gather at the church, but David called and said there's been a change of plans. Please call me back so I can understand what's going on. The change of plans had been Sophie and David's decision to elope that morning, taking advantage of the marriage license that had been issued in David's name, but not specifying the bride's identity with sufficient legal precision to prevent substitution of sisters at the crucial moment of commitment. We didn't want to hurt you more than necessary, Sophie had explained while adjusting her veil in my mirror, her voice carrying the kind of considerate concern that people use when they're proud of their thoughtfulness in managing someone else's devastation. A public ceremony where you had to watch us exchange vows seemed unnecessarily cruel when we could handle the legal formalities privately and let you process this news without an audience. The thoughtfulness had been breathtaking in its selfishness, allowing Sophie to claim the wedding she wanted while avoiding the social complications of having to explain to 300 guests why she was marrying her sister's fiancé on what was supposed to be Emma's wedding day. "Where are you going for your honeymoon?" I had asked with the numb curiosity of someone whose emotional processing system had temporarily shut down to prevent complete psychological collapse. "The Maldives resort you booked for your honeymoon," Sophie had replied, without apparent recognition that this detail might be particularly painful for me to hear. "David said it would be a shame to waste such a beautiful reservation, and since you paid for everything already, we thought it made sense to use the trip rather than lose the money to cancellation fees." The resort reservation that I had researched for months, saved overtime wages to afford, and planned as the romantic beginning of my marriage, was now going to serve as Sophie and David's celebration of their successful deception and my complete humiliation. "The reservation is in my name," I had pointed out with the kind of practical objection that seemed important, despite its obvious irrelevance to people who had already demonstrated their willingness to manipulate legal and financial systems for their convenience. "David called this morning and explained that there was a family emergency that required you to cancel, but that your sister would be using the reservation instead," Sophie had said with casual confidence in her ability to charm her way through administrative obstacles. The resort was very understanding about accommodating the change, especially when David mentioned that the family was dealing with difficult circumstances. The difficult circumstances they had referenced were the emotional and financial devastation they had created through their affair, now being used as justification for claiming the honeymoon that was supposed to celebrate my marriage while I dealt with the wreckage of their betrayal. "I need you to leave," I had finally said, my voice carrying more strength than I felt as I realized that continuing to engage with Sophie's explanations would only increase my psychological damage without changing any practical realities. "Emma, I hope someday you'll understand that this was the best outcome for everyone involved," Sophie had said, while gathering her purse and gloves, her tone suggesting that I should be grateful for her consideration in stealing my fiancé, rather than resentful about the methods she had used to accomplish her goals. After she left, I had spent hours sitting in the silence of my apartment, surrounded by physical evidence of the life I had been building, with someone who had never actually intended to build that life with me, the wedding dress hanging in the closet, the honeymoon suitcase packed with carefully chosen outfits, the joint bank account I had been contributing to for months while David used the money to court my sister. The financial implications of the betrayal were almost as devastating as the emotional consequences. The anonymous donor program that I had funded for over a year, the wedding expenses that I had worked overtime to afford, the shared apartment lease that I would now have to handle alone, and the honeymoon that I had paid for, but Sophie would be enjoying while I dealt with the practical aftermath of their deception. But the most devastating realization was that my entire understanding of my own worth and desirability had been built on a relationship with someone who had been performing love while pursuing someone else. The confidence I had gained from David's apparent choice to marry me despite Sophie's obvious superiority had been based on lies that were now exposed as calculated manipulation rather than genuine affection. As evening approached and I faced the reality of calling vendors to cancel services and relatives to explain the situation, I realized that Sophie and David's betrayal had revealed something important. I had been living a lie for so long that I had forgotten what my own authentic desires and boundaries actually were. Tomorrow, they would be on my honeymoon, while I began the process of rebuilding a life that was actually mine. The eviction notice I had carefully prepared and legally filed was served to David and Sophie on Tuesday morning of their honeymoon week, delivered by Maldives resort staff to their overwater villa at exactly the moment they would be enjoying the champagne breakfast that I had specifically requested when booking their romantic package 6 months earlier. Ms. Emma Chen, the resort manager, had called my phone at 3 a.m. local time, his voice carrying the professional confusion of someone trying to navigate an unprecedented situation involving property rights, international law, and guests who were apparently not who they claimed to be when checking into their accommodation. "Yes, this is Emma," I had replied, sitting in my home office surrounded by legal documents and rental agreements that I had been reviewing with vengeful precision for the past week, while Sophie and David enjoyed what they believed was a consequence-free honeymoon, funded by my generosity and naivety. "I'm calling about the reservation at the Serenity Resort Maldives under your name," he had continued with diplomatic caution. "We've received some legal documentation that suggests there may be complications regarding the guests currently occupying your villa reservation." The legal documentation he referenced was an eviction notice for the luxury apartment that I had been anonymously funding for David's use for over 2 years, combined with fraud reports filed against both David and Sophie for identity theft related to their use of honeymoon reservations that had been booked and paid for under my name without my current consent. "The guests currently in the villa are not authorized to use reservations made in my name," I had explained to the resort manager while reviewing the credit card charges that showed David and Sophie had been enjoying spa treatments, private dinners, and excursion packages that they were charging to my account without permission. "I'm prepared to provide legal documentation, proving that they obtained access to this reservation through deceptive means." The conversation that followed had been deeply satisfying as I explained the situation to resort staff, who were increasingly horrified by the ethical implications of guests who had used family betrayal and identity manipulation to access luxury accommodations that they had no legal right to enjoy. "We'll need to ask the guests to settle any outstanding charges and make alternative accommodation arrangements," the resort manager had said, with the kind of diplomatic firmness that luxury hospitality professionals use when dealing with guests whose behavior has violated both legal standards and basic human decency. "The resort cannot continue to provide services under fraudulent reservation circumstances." The outstanding charges that David and Sophie would need to settle included $3,400 in spa treatments, $2,100 in private dining experiences, $1,800 in alcoholic beverages, and $2,700 in excursion activities that they had enjoyed while believing they were spending my money without consequence or accountability. But the eviction notice for David's apartment was the more devastating component of my legal retaliation, since it would force them to return to the United States, only to discover that David no longer had housing arrangements that he could afford on his actual financial resources rather than my anonymous subsidies. "The tenant identified as David Chen has violated lease terms through fraudulent financial representation," explained Jennifer Walsh, the property attorney I had hired to handle the eviction proceedings with maximum legal efficiency and minimum opportunity for David to negotiate Yankee or alternative arrangements. "Anonymous financial assistance that was obtained through deceptive means does not constitute legitimate income for lease qualification purposes." The deceptive means she referenced included David's failure to disclose to his landlord that his rent payments were being provided by his fiancé rather than generated through his own employment or family support, creating a fraudulent tenancy that could be terminated immediately once the deception was exposed and the anonymous funding was withdrawn. Additionally, the tenant has been using the property for purposes not specified in the lease agreement, Jennifer had continued, while reviewing evidence that David had been bringing Sophie to the apartment for romantic encounters that violated lease terms, prohibiting cohabitation, or regular overnight guests who were not listed as authorized residents. The lease violations provided additional legal grounds for immediate eviction without the typical notice periods that might give David time to arrange alternative housing or negotiate payment plans that would allow him to remain in accommodations that he had never actually been able to afford. "What's the timeline for the eviction?" I had asked, reviewing my calendar to ensure that David and Sophie's return from their shortened honeymoon would coincide perfectly with the discovery that they no longer had housing arrangements waiting for them. "The eviction will be executed on Friday," Jennifer had replied with professional satisfaction at the precision of legal timing that would maximize the practical consequences of David's deception. "All personal belongings will be removed and placed in storage, with access contingent on payment of accumulated fees and charges. The accumulated fees would include not only the standard costs associated with eviction proceedings, but also reimbursement for the anonymous rental assistance that I had been providing for over 2 years under fraudulent circumstances that entitled me to legal recovery of misappropriated funds." By the time David and Sophie returned from their abbreviated honeymoon, they would discover that their betrayal had cost them not only the moral high ground, but also the practical foundation of the lifestyle they had been building at my expense while pursuing their affair behind my back. Sophie's voice on the phone was unrecognizable, stripped of its usual confidence and musical quality, reduced to the raw desperation of someone whose perfectly planned life had collapsed into chaos that she had no idea how to manage. The call came at exactly 3:17 a.m. on the Friday night, when she and David had returned from their abbreviated honeymoon to discover that their betrayal had generated consequences neither of them had anticipated. "Emma, please, I need to talk to you," she had sobbed into the phone, her words punctuated by hiccuping breaths that suggested she had been crying for hours before working up the courage to call the sister she had betrayed and humiliated just 2 weeks earlier. "Something terrible has happened and I don't know what to do." The terrible something that had happened was the systematic dismantling of the comfortable life that David had built using my anonymous financial support, combined with the discovery that their romantic adventure had legal and practical consequences that extended far beyond hurt feelings and family drama. "We came back from the Maldives and David's apartment was empty," Sophie had continued through tears that seemed genuine rather than manipulative, though I had lost the ability to distinguish between my sister's authentic emotions and her strategic performances. "All his stuff is in storage, and there's an eviction notice saying he owes thousands of dollars in back rent and legal fees." The eviction had proceeded exactly as Jennifer Walsh had predicted, with professional efficiency that left no opportunity for negotiation or appeal. David's belongings had been cataloged and removed to a storage facility that would charge daily fees for maintaining possession of items that he couldn't afford to reclaim without settling his housing debts. "How much does he owe?" I had asked with curious detachment, interested in confirming that my legal strategy had achieved its intended financial impact, while feeling surprisingly little satisfaction at Sophie's distress. "Over $15,000, Sophie had replied, with the kind of shock that comes from someone who had never had to consider the real cost of lifestyle choices that had always been subsidized by other people's generosity. "The lawyer says that David was getting anonymous financial assistance that was withdrawn because of lease violations and fraudulent representation. The $15,000 represented 2 years of anonymous rent assistance that I was legally entitled to recover once David's deceptive circumstances were exposed, plus eviction costs, legal fees, and storage charges that had accumulated during the week while Sophie and David were enjoying their honeymoon at my expense. "Emma, I know we hurt you terribly, but please, you have to help us," Sophie had pleaded with the kind of desperate vulnerability that she had never shown during our childhood, when her problems were always solved by parental intervention and social advantages that protected her from real consequences. The request for help was breathtaking in its audacity, coming from someone who had spent our entire lives assuming that I existed to provide support and assistance whenever her choices created problems that she couldn't solve independently. "Help you with what exactly?" I had asked, genuinely curious about what kind of assistance Sophie imagined I might provide to the people who had stolen my wedding, used my honeymoon reservation, and financially devastated me through their elaborate deception. "We need somewhere to stay," Sophie had said through renewed crying, apparently expecting that her distress would motivate me to offer housing solutions for the people who had made me homeless in my own life. "David can't afford another apartment without the financial assistance he was getting, and I can't afford to support both of us on my gallery salary." The gallery salary that Sophie had always treated as supplemental income rather than essential employment, since her comfortable lifestyle had been subsidized first by our parents and then by David's resources that were actually my resources provided through anonymous channels. "Where are you staying tonight?" I had asked, not because I intended to offer solutions, but because I was curious about how they were managing the immediate crisis of their housing situation. "In David's car," Sophie had admitted with the kind of humiliation that comes from discovering that romantic adventures have practical consequences that couldn't be solved through charm or family connections. "We spent everything we had on extending our honeymoon after the resort kicked us out, and now we don't have money for even a cheap hotel." The irony was perfect. Sophie and David were spending their wedding night sleeping in a car because they had assumed that my generosity was unlimited and unconditional, even after they had betrayed and humiliated me in the most devastating way imaginable. "Sophie, I'm going to say something that I should have said years ago," I had replied, feeling clarity that had been absent throughout our entire relationship as sisters and family members. "Your problems are not my responsibility to solve. They never were, but especially not when those problems were created by choices you made that directly harmed me." The silence that followed was broken only by Sophie's continued crying as she processed what appeared to be the first time in her adult life that Emma was not going to sacrifice her own well-being to enable Sophie's poor decisions. "Emma, please, we're family," she had tried again, falling back on biological connections that she had never honored when her choices conflicted with my emotional or financial security. "Family members don't steal each other's fiancés," I had replied, before hanging up the phone and turning off my ringer so I could sleep peacefully for the first time since discovering their betrayal. 6 months after the 3 a.m. phone call that marked the end of my relationship with Sophie, and the beginning of my authentic life. I stood in the office of my new marketing consultancy, looking out at the city skyline through windows that I had purchased rather than rented, in a building that represented security built through my own efforts rather than sacrifices made for people who didn't deserve them. The business had grown beyond my most optimistic projections, fueled by the creative energy and professional focus that had been liberated when I stopped spending emotional resources on managing other people's problems and financial resources on subsidizing other people's poor choices. Without the drain of David's anonymous support and Sophie's constant emotional crises, I had discovered reserves of capability and ambition that had been buried under years of caretaking and people-pleasing. "Emma, the Morrison account wants to expand their contract," announced Lisa, my business partner, and the first person I had hired when the consultancy outgrew what I could manage independently. "They're so impressed with the campaign results that they want us to handle their entire digital marketing portfolio." The Morrison account represented exactly the kind of creative challenge that had always excited me, but which I had never pursued aggressively, because my energy had been focused on maintaining relationships with people who took my support for granted, rather than building professional relationships with people who valued my expertise. "Schedule a meeting for next week," I had replied, while reviewing financial reports that showed consistent, month-over-month growth that was creating genuine wealth rather than just covering expenses and other people's debts. "And let them know we'll need to discuss expanding our team to handle the increased workload properly." The team expansion would be my 4th hire in 6 months, evidence of business success that was allowing me to create employment opportunities for other people while building the kind of professional reputation that attracted clients who paid well because they recognized quality work. But the professional success was secondary to the personal liberation that had come from understanding that I had been living someone else's version of my life for years, making choices based on other people's needs rather than my own desires, and accepting treatment that I would never tolerate if it were directed toward someone I cared about. "Your sister called again," Lisa had mentioned carefully, knowing that family topics required delicate handling, since I had been clear that Sophie was not welcome in my professional or personal space. "I told her you weren't available and took a message." The messages from Sophie had become less frequent over the past 6 months, but more desperate, as she discovered that the consequences of betraying me extended beyond immediate housing and financial problems to long-term social and family repercussions that had isolated her from support systems she had always taken for granted. "She and David broke up 3 months ago," my mother had reported during one of our awkward monthly lunch meetings, her voice carrying the concern of someone who was finally recognizing that Sophie's pattern of poor decisions was creating problems that couldn't be solved through parental intervention. Apparently, the financial stress was too much for their relationship to handle. The breakup had been predictable given that their romance had been built on the excitement of forbidden betrayal, rather than the practical foundation required for managing real-world challenges like unemployment, housing instability, and social ostracism that resulted from their treatment of me. "Sophie moved back home with us," my mother had continued with the resigned tone of parents who were learning that enabling adult children's poor choices created ongoing problems rather than temporary assistance. "She's been looking for work, but her reputation in the local art community has been damaged by how she handled the situation with you and David." The damaged reputation was a natural consequence of choosing personal gratification over professional ethics in a small industry where everyone knew everyone, and word traveled quickly about people who couldn't be trusted with important relationships or responsibilities. "Emma, I need to ask you something directly," my mother had said during our most recent lunch meeting, her voice carrying the awkwardness of someone who had finally recognized that she needed to account for decades of differential treatment between her daughters. "Did we fail Sophie by making things too easy for her? Did we fail you by not recognizing how much you were sacrificing to take care of everyone else?" The questions represented more self-awareness than my parents had ever demonstrated about their family dynamics, and I had appreciated their willingness to examine their own contributions to the situation, rather than just trying to convince me to forgive Sophie for the sake of family harmony. "You taught us both that love was conditional on performance," I had replied honestly. "But you set different performance standards for Sophie and me. She learned that being charming and beautiful was enough to earn support, while I learned that being useful and self-sacrificing was the only way to earn attention." The observation had clearly been painful for my mother to hear, but necessary for understanding why I couldn't simply restore family relationships that had been built on fundamentally unequal foundations. Standing in my office, surrounded by evidence of success that belonged entirely to me, I realized that Sophie's betrayal had been the catalyst I needed to discover who I actually was when I stopped being who everyone else needed me to be. I was finally free to build a life that served my own dreams, rather than enabling other people's.